In November 1985, 4 American hostages in Beirut sent a message to the Archbishop of Canterbury's envoy, Terry Waite, appealing for his help.
The conditions of our captivity are very bad. They are far worse now.
The hostages told Waite they thought the kidnappers were ready to meet him face to face in Beirut.
That was it. I prepared to go, knowing that I was going into a complex and appalling and difficult situation, and going alone.
ظل وجود ساحة سياسية عسكرية مفتوحة في لبنان، مفتوحة لكافة الاحتمالات في غياب السلطة الرسمية وفي غياب الدولة وفي غياب الأمن الواحد الذي يحفظ الأمن في جميع المناطق.
Beirut was racked by civil war. Under the cover of the fighting, kidnapped groups seeking revenge for what they saw as the West's anti-Muslim policies in the Middle East were grabbing Westerners off the streets. One militia intelligence officer, whose code name was the Baron, had seen his own group kidnap thousands of Lebanese rivals.
كيف بلبنان الذي لا يوجد جهاز أمني واحد والذي يوجد ساحة مفتوحة، حروب متنقلة، معارك دائمة في كل الساحات، بالإمكان أن تتم عملية إخفاء أو تمويه.
At the end of November, Terry Waite flew into this chaos.
There is the natural run of adrenaline, which is mixed with excitement and fear, and also a certain bewilderment. And suddenly you're in the middle of it.
I am here because I want to see.
I was there in a very vulnerable position, waiting for something to happen.
The biggest kidnap gang called itself Islamic Jihad. Its members came from the ranks of Lebanon's Shiite population, the most downtrodden of the country's religious and ethnic groups. The gang had close ties to the main Shiite party, Hezbollah, and were backed by Ayatollah Khomeini's Iran. It was Islamic Jihad that had summoned Waite to Beirut.
You take a book. You're in a room. There's a telephone. Outside, perhaps, there's the sound of gunfire. You lie on the bed. You can't sleep because you're so anxious. Then there was a telephone call, and someone at the other end said words to this effect: "I'm the person you want to see."
The kidnappers summoned Waite to a secret meeting place and blindfolded him.
I said, "I have a Polaroid camera outside. Will you take it? And will you bring me back photographs of the people with whom you have contact, of the hostages, all the hostages with whom you have contact?"
The guards came in with a newspaper that Terry Waite had signed, and they held it up in front of us and took pictures of us. This is obviously confirmation that they were who they said they were.
We were really hyped up, and we thought, wow, finally we get out of this mess and we go home.
The kidnappers told Waite that they would release the hostages only if he obtained the release of 17 fellow Lebanese Shiites who had attacked Western embassies in Kuwait and were imprisoned there. Waite asked US officials to help arrange for him to visit Kuwait, but the US government, determined to appear tough on terrorism, turned Waite down. When the kidnappers heard, they told Waite that if he didn't secure the release of their brothers, he had better leave Beirut.
Since my arrival in Beirut several days ago, it's clear to me that further steps are required. And so at this stage,
It was Christmas Day that we heard on radio that night Terry Waite saying, "I'm going to have to go home without the hostages."
have further contact with other parties who are involved in this.
We then had our church service. It didn't last long. Nobody was in the mood for Christmas because we had hopes and dreams and excitement that we were going to be released on Christmas Day. And then on Christmas Eve to get it by radio, boom, you're not going home, more work to be done. We just entered this black depression. And then Father Marty got us together and we started saying prayers and singing Christmas carols, trying to lift our spirits. But it was a pretty black Christmas.
Terry Waite's mission had failed because the US government would not be party to the deal the kidnappers had put to him.
For the life of me at the time, I couldn't understand why it was so difficult. You know that there are a whole range of things happening around you, but what they are, you don't know. Who is playing what game in the shadows?
The game in the shadows involved America and Iran. Publicly, President Reagan refused to deal with terrorists, but secretly, 2 months before Waite's mission, America had secured the release of one hostage by selling arms to the kidnapper's sponsor, Iran. Some in the president's cabinet were unhappy with the policy.
We felt that if arms were sold to Iran, that was in conflict with what we were trying to get our allies to do. And sooner or later, all these things become public. Even if they don't become public, you're talking out of both sides of your mouth at once, and that's a bad idea.
Such reservations were overruled by President Reagan. A member of his national security staff, Colonel Oliver North, flew to London to meet an Iranian arms dealer, Manouchehr Ghorbanifar. Ghorbanifar wanted to do more arms for hostage deals.
He said, clearly, you have needs. I can give you $1 million of this. I said, Mr. Ghorbanifar, this is not the way I do business. I'm a serving officer in the U.S. Marines.
Ghorbanifar then added a new proposal.
Ghorbanifar says, well, some of the profits, instead of going to you as a bribe in this bathroom conversation, they don't have to go to you. They can be used to support the Nicaraguan resistance. Now, I will confess to you, at that point, I brought that initiative back to my boss, and everybody nodded and said, that's not so bad. At that point, the mullahs in Tehran began to support, with or without their knowledge, the Nicaraguan resistance.
Getting the hostages out had become part of a dangerous, tangled web. The US government was now selling arms to Iran, which it had publicly pledged not to do, and using the secret profits illegally to fund rebels in Latin America.
For an operation like this to go on, for Oliver North to have such extraordinary authority to engage important interests of the United States in the Middle East as well as Central America, could only have happened because he clearly understood that he was acting in behalf of the president's wishes. And North was quite pleased with that kind of assignment and took it on with some enthusiasm.
In his office next to the White House, Oliver North was running what amounted to a covert foreign policy. That he was a most unusual public servant was obvious to Peggy Say, sister of American hostage Terry Anderson.
I remember there was a poster on the wall of like a little Contra-Rebel child, and it was a parody of what you see in the Feed the Children posters and everything. It was like, for 25 cents a day you can support a Contra-Rebel or whatever. It was very funny. And I had noticed behind me in the wall there was a red light. And Ollie noticed me looking at it, and he said, you know what that's for? Anybody comes up those stairs that's not supposed to be here or threatening or anything, that red light will flash and, like I can hit the deck, or I don't know what his plan of escape was. But I I'm looking at him and I don't know whether to be frightened or amused.
As Oliver North pursued his deals, the kidnappers in Beirut began to develop not only prisons for their hostages, but also a network of spies to gather reports on all foreigners in the city.
هناك مطار واحد وهناك مرفأ واحد وهناك عدد محصور ومحدد من الفنادق وهناك عدد محدد من سيارة التاكسي وهناك كثير من الناشطين الذين يعملون لجمع المعلومات وبيع هذه المعلومات وهناك كثير من المندوبين التابعين لأجهزة أمنية محلية وغير محلية.
The kidnappers had got nothing from Oliver North's deals with Iran. They threatened to escalate the hostage-taking. Their next targets were the French and British.
مش بالضرورة يكون البريطانيين بتوقيت معين عملوا شيء، بس اللي أنا بقدره إنه هيدي اللي مش معتدي اليوم معتدى امبارح، مش معتدي امبارح هيعتدي على بكرة، فإذا هؤلاء مجموعة باطل، مجموعة معتدين، كان أمريكان ولا فرنسيين ولا إنجليز ولا اللي ممكن يكونوا معهم. لابد من مواجهتهم، تشكيل ضغط عليهم حتى يفكوا عدوانهم عنا.
In early 1986, new kidnap groups emerged. Some took up political causes, others wanted money. The kidnapping of British UN worker Alec Collette had been claimed by one shadowy group. British teachers Philip Padfield and Lee Douglas were now taken by another. Days later, a teacher from Belfast, Brian Keenan, was taken by a third group.
I was leaving it was an old Turkish villa I lived in, and I walked through the garden, opened the gate, closed the gate behind me, and a white Mercedes pulled over in the street, and these guys jumped out with Kalashnikovs and guns. And I realised at that instant, I'm going away now. They told me to get on the floor, and I couldn't because there was no room with two guys at each side with their guns. So they shouted, down, down. And I remember laying my head down on one of the guy's knees. And strangely, he stroked my head. And as we were driving along, they said, you like Mrs. Thatcher? Which I remember, I said, of course I don't. I'm Irish, I told you. And I remember the guy on the passenger seat looking at the driver as if to say, something's wrong, we've got the wrong one. Of course, they could hardly deliver me back like a returned package.
In London, the British government had firm views on how to react to the kidnapping of its citizens. The Americans had begun secretly to deal, but the British did not yet know this.
Sitting in offices, in government offices, whether in London or Paris, you have to make up your mind how you are going to play this. There is always a temptation to do what the terrorists ask, that is, make concessions, make gestures, perhaps even provide them with goodies, supply them with arms or something like that, and in the hope that you will thereby release your citizens rapidly, get them back home. But you have to think of the wider consequences. You have to remind yourself that although these particular hostages might be released, then others will very probably be taken up afterwards, and the price will have risen.
The British said no deals. By April 1986, the kidnappers held 17 American, French and British hostages in Beirut. Within 2 weeks, 4 of them would be dead.
It was the tininess of the place and the intensity of the heat. It was 6 foot by about 4 foot. You could reach out with your hands and touch both walls. Your body was wet, constantly wet. So you had to take all your clothes off. And the insects sticking to you. I remember going to the toilet, and as I squatted over the kind of hole in the ground, these cockroaches came crawling up, and you had to try and kick them back in again, but what was the point? They still kept crawling up. So you had to smuggle back a piece of paper and do what you had to do on a piece of paper and hide it. So you had to carry your own filth and sleep with it, carry it to the toilet, feed it to the cockroaches.
Lee Douglas had been kidnapped 2 weeks before Brian Keenan. In a Norfolk village, his mother waited for news.
The Foreign Office rang every day. We're still trying to trace them, Mrs. Douglas. There's no news yet. But it's a terribly helpless situation. I mean, the thoughts that went through our minds, stupid thoughts in some respect. One thought I was concerned about his little cat. Thought, well, poor little thing, who's feeding the cat? Silly things you think about.
The fate of Mrs. Douglas's son was to be sealed by a bomb attack on a Berlin nightclub, which killed and injured US soldiers. The Americans blamed Libya and wanted to retaliate.
The Americans were determined to act. They'd been gearing themselves up for some time, and this was clearly the casus belli. And they sent us a message saying they proposed to carry out a raid on targets in Libya, and they wanted to use F-111 aircraft stationed in Britain.
And we sent back a telegram forthwith that night, asking some key questions about it. Had they taken account of the risk of generating a tit-for-tat escalation of violence? Had they considered the position of the Western hostages?
It was basically a pretty lonely decision taken by Margaret Thatcher. I would not want to mislead you. I don't remember anyone standing up and saying, we must not do this because it will endanger the hostages' lives. There was a sad recognition that that danger would be increased, but a feeling that nonetheless policy had to be decided on the basis of principle and of what was right.
On the 15th of April 1986, Mrs. Thatcher allowed US planes to take off from bases in Britain and bomb Libya, killing, the Libyans claimed, dozens of civilians, including President Gaddafi's adopted daughter.
When the Libyan raid was announced, my husband was here then. He'd had the radio on down here in the kitchen, and he came up and he said, well, he said, that'll be Lee's lot. And I said, whatever are you talking about? And he said, well, he said, the Americans have bombed Libya from our bases. So he said, that'll be Lee and Philip taken care of.
She showed up extremely well. I think she was at her best in this kind of situation. It was clear-cut. She'd taken a decision of principle. She didn't hedge it, go round behind it. She stuck to it. What she said, she did. That was one of her great strengths.
Hours after the raid, the American Peter Kilburn and the British hostages Philip Padfield and Lee Douglas were sold by their kidnappers to a rival gang.
وبعد أحداث ليبيا على ما أذكر ويذكره الكثير أن هذه الجماعة كانت كذلك مستأجرة. قامت بعملية الخطف لقاء بدل مالي وسلمت الرهائن لهذا الفريق الذي يعمل مع الحكومة الليبية.
3 days after the Libyan raid, the gangs took the hostages to the hills outside Beirut and exacted a brutal revenge.
والمجرمة تاتشر اللذان يحملان شعبيهما أوزار ما تقترفه أيديهم الآثمة. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر.
The body of executed Englishman Alec Collette was never discovered. The bodies of the American Peter Kilburn and British hostages Philip Padfield and Lee Douglas were found abandoned on a mountainside.
It doesn't follow that she didn't feel for the consequences, particularly when they were paid, as you say, by other people. It's a tough business, running a government.
To put it honestly, I think if Mark Thatcher had been in the same situation in Lebanon, I very much doubt if it would have happened. I'm probably wrong. She's probably a stronger-minded person than I give her credit, but as a mother, it wouldn't be easy. As a parent myself, I can understand your grief and your feeling that your son was a victim of a war against terrorism in which he wished no part. I know and understand your feelings. Yours sincerely, Margaret Thatcher. I'm afraid I didn't reply. I just couldn't reply. I expect I should have done out of courtesy, but what do you say?
He died as a sad consequence of the situation in the Middle East and the decisions the British government took.
That hard?
Mm-hmm.
That simple?
Not simple. But that's the truth.
News of the American bombing of Libya reached the hostages.
The guards threw down a copy of Newsweek and they pointed to the story of the bombing of Libya by the American Air Force and said, "This is why you are here." To which I could only reply, well, what the hell has that got to do with me? I remember, as a kind of act of defiance, defecating on the story about Libya and Gaddafi and the American Air Force. Kind of contempt for all that. Because it had nothing to do with me, but it had everything to do with me. It was probably the most satisfying defecation I've ever had.
After the raid on Libya, the streets of Beirut became even more dangerous for foreigners. A young British journalist, John McCarthy, was ordered to return to London.
I was kidnapped on the way to the airport. Literally, I was going home, and the car stopped. A car screeched in front of us, and there was sort of stones flying up and gravel. They put a blindfold on me, and then I realized I was getting very frightened. One of the guys was saying, "Don't be frightened. No need to be frightened. This is not your problem. This is your country problem." And I mean, that wasn't obviously very reassuring, given that it didn't seem like my country was there at all. It was just me.
The following day came the news of John McCarthy's detention, kidnapping, arrest, as it happened, in Beirut. So that added to our distress. But it was a risk that we had accepted with our eyes open, with reluctance and anxiety.
3 weeks after the American raid on Libya, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher and Francois Mitterrand publicly reiterated their policy of not negotiating with terrorists.
We believe the way to deal with terrorism is on a unified front, that we're in this all together.
But America had been doing deals with Iran for 9 months behind its allies' backs. And now the French were about to start dealing too. The French government had just learned that the kidnappers had executed a French hostage 2 months earlier. Relatives anxiously waited for information on the 8 French hostages still held in Lebanon.
Que l'on déclenche non sans cynisme dans l'imagination des gens et qui cache le plus froid des égoïsmes. Qu'il me soit permis de...
Et quelques vidéos qui sont parvenues à Paris, c'est une image pitoyable. Et en vérité, ces vidéos, c'était quelque chose de très important pour nous. Moi, j'en aurais fait tous les jours. Parce que d'abord, premièrement, ça, c'était un moyen pour ma femme, mes enfants, de savoir que j'étais vivant. Et puis, ça permettait aussi de faire passer des petites choses.
President Mitterrand thought that America and Britain were still holding to the public policy they had all agreed, no deals with terrorists. But now he was having reservations about committing himself to a common line on terrorism.
Je ne voulais pas que les décisions fussent prises contre le sentiment de la France, par une majorité de circonstances au sein des 7. Tout ce qui touchait au terrorisme et donc à la sécurité de mon pays devait avoir l'accord plein et entier de mon pays.
Mitterrand decided to break with his allies. He secretly sent a French-Lebanese doctor to Beirut to barter with the kidnappers.
On va directement chez les responsables, chez eux, dans leur quartier général. Carrément, dans le quartier général, je voyais mes interlocuteurs avec qui c'était un marchand d'as comme un marchand de tapis. J'amenais des propositions, je ramenais des contre-propositions.
Hot on the heels of President Mitterrand's emissary were envoys for the French opposition, Jacques Chirac's Gaullist party. Government and opposition were trying to outbid each other.
Les otages avaient pris une sorte d'importance. On s'était mis à penser que les élections dépendraient des otages et que celui qui ferait libérer les otages gagnerait les élections présidentielles. Donc il y avait une sorte de frénésie comme ça.
With days to go before French elections, President Mitterrand thought he'd scored a campaign triumph. Lebanese prisoners in France would be freed in exchange for the hostages.
Tout le monde était prêt. Même l'avion était prêt pour les ramener. Là, mes interlocuteurs m'ont dit clairement qu'ils préfèrent attendre après les élections parce qu'on leur a offert plus. Alors eux m'ont affirmé que c'est l'opposition qui les assure d'offrir plus après les élections.
In London, Mrs. Thatcher and her advisors, unaware of the American deals, were horrified when they learned of the French activities.
Well, our reaction to the way the French conducted themselves was one of irritation, some dismay, perhaps a little disgust, frankly. They were very loud in their condemnation of terrorism. They puffed themselves up as great defenders of the common line on this. All the time, behind the scenes, they were doing deals. And once you discover there's a weak link in the chain, a country which is prepared to negotiate and to deal, then that policy is undermined, no doubt about it.
The American raid on Libya and the international deals had created a thriving market in hostages. Nearly every week, new hostages were being taken.
الكل يعلم عن غزارة المبعوثين وغزارة المندوبين وغزارة حملة الحقائب المالية وحملة العروض الذين كانوا يتنقلون في لبنان وفي المنطقة بحثا عن من يبيع أو يشتري رهينة من الرهائن الموجودين في لبنان.
Rumors of the rising price of hostages reached the 4 Americans held together in one underground cell.
Saeed, the guard, asked me, how much are you worth to your government? I said, well, the chemicals in my body dehydrate me $2.87. He said, no, be realistic. I said, $500,000. He says, oh no, you're worth $7.5 million.
As their prisoners' value rose, the kidnappers tightened their security. The French were locked together in a basement in southern Beirut.
Nos conditions de détention ont totalement changé. Commencions notre descente vers l'enfer. Hein. Et là, véritablement, vous savez, comme le rideau de fer d'un magasin qui était ouvert un petit peu sur l'extérieur.
Shut away in dark basements for weeks on end, the hostages were thrown back upon the only resources available to them, memory and imagination.
cette enveloppe de fromage, de fromage Kiri, avec cette colline, ce clocher, cette route, etc. Bon, ça débonde hein, comme un barrage, votre imagination, et alors à partir de là, vous partez. C'est la route des châteaux, tous ces grands châteaux là que l'on connaît, Lingebage, Cause des Stournelles, Lafitte, etc. Toute cette représentation symbolique de ce qu'est la France. Et à la fois ça me faisait du bien et du mal. Parce que je me disais que je ne reverrais plus cela.
I remember lifting an orange, and its roundness, and its texture, and its smell, and I remember I just licked it, and just sat and looked at it for days and days. It's a kind of an act of worship, of homage, and after some days the guards came in and, why you don't eat? And how could I explain to this guy, who had very little English, how important, how valuable this was? And I just couldn't eat it. I just sat mesmerised by it. And it was beginning to decay. Even its decay put a different kind of perfume into the cell. I suppose a part of the difficulty with dealing with despair was the monotony of the day, because every day was the same. It was an action replay of the day before and the day before and the week before and the week before. There was little to relieve that awful, monochrome, awful emptiness. You develop whatever kind of strategies you have to deal with it. Maybe you sing. I always loved Sonny Boy Williamson, and I'm not musical, but I had my own kind of imaginary harmonica. Played all these tunes that I didn't really know.
During 1986, some of the hostages were moved to the ancient town of Baalbek in eastern Lebanon. The kidnappers moved them frequently to discourage rescue attempts.
Donc, ils nous ont ligotés, là, on était des véritables momies, on ne pouvait plus bouger, et ils nous ont mis dans un cercueil en fer, sous la voiture.
And they'd drive you down bad roads for hours and hours and hours, and bang your face, and get miserable cold, splashed from the mud puddles, and smell the diesel fume because you're lying next to the exhaust pipe. Your gorge would rise from this diesel fuel, but your mouth's covered, so you can't throw up. You know, if you throw up, you're going to drown in your own vomit. And you just have to fight it back down again.
After one move, Brian Keenan, who had spent 3 months in solitary confinement, was pushed into a new, larger cell.
I began slowly to lift the end of the blindfold up, and I could see this very smart pair of shoes. And I was sort of conscious that there was still another person in there, and I was thinking, what's happening? So very tentatively, I was sort of tilting my head back originally. So I'd see, bare feet, and my eye following up the line of his body, and then onto his face. And then I started just seeing a mass of beard, and I thought, this could be Hezbollah, because they all have very heavy beards. There was this other prisoner doing exactly the same thing, slowly lifting off his blindfold. By the time my eyes, I could see another blindfold, another hand doing exactly the same thing, and these two very piercing eyes. Looking at this complete stranger, who was looking back at you, almost a mirror image, doing exactly what you were doing. And Brian was just sort of covered with this, a huge amount of hair and this huge beard. And McCarthy's first words were in this awfully well-spoken English accent was, "Fuck me, Ben Gunn." He was saying, no, I'm Brian Keenan. I said, yeah, I know you're Brian Keenan. And I said, who's Ben Gunn? And I was thinking it was another hostage, another teacher or something. And he said, don't you remember? Ben Gunn, Treasure Island. And I suddenly twigged. And I thought, well, this guy can't be insane. Although with the first expression like that, one might well have thought he was.
The friends and family of John McCarthy were becoming increasingly bitter at the lack of government action.
It's not so easy, of course, when the families call upon you and saying, and what are you doing for him? What are you doing to get him out? The easy answer would be say, yes, well, we're planning a package and we're going to give them some goodies. You have to say, we are not doing anything in that line, but outside that we are doing the very most we can.
The Foreign Office admitted that they weren't doing anything. Their policy was to do nothing. And it was quite a shock, because I had always assumed that they would be behind the scenes getting on with things.
What do? Do we act to alleviate this particular bit of pain here, to save this life, that life, regardless of the cost? Or do we look at the wider picture and ask ourselves, what is in it, what is in the balance of our interests and of general Western interests?
There we were, the two of us, alone, completely alone against the world. I think we very quickly realised that my survival depends on you and yours on me. We had to shit in the corner in the same room. We had no food. We were anxious, frightened, and sometimes getting on each other's nerves. You fucking Irish bastard. You fucking Irish bastard. Who are you calling an Irish bastard? And then it would be off, you Brit, so. In another situation, in another place, I would hardly have spoken to it. I would probably have said, there's that middle-class fucker or something. One could call him, you're an absolute bastard, Brian, but it was much better Irish Fenian bastard. And it creates a world which is very funny, very healthy, which is kind of life-inspiring, full of foul-mouthed abuse. It's an Irish black, Fenian bastard, Irish whatever. It was almost childlike at times. You're a bearded bastard, just sort of crazy things, or I really hate your beard. Like, it was a lifesaver that I was with John. I could have been with somebody I didn't get on with, or vice versa.
In France, President Mitterrand's government was still negotiating to get the French hostages out. The new Interior Minister, Charles Pasqua, seemed to be getting through to the kidnappers with deals involving arms and money. The Americans, who were still engaged in their own secret arms for hostage deals, discovered what the French were up to.
I didn't complain to Pasqua about any duplicity from the French point of view. After all, we're engaged in the same sort of duplicitous practice ourselves. It's the way the game was being played.
Je crois que c'était une opération un peu particulière, mais dont l'objectif était louable.
The British, believing that the Americans were sticking to the agreed policy of not dealing, were appalled by the frenzy of French activity in Beirut.
I think it weakened the general Western position. I think it encouraged other blackmail. But this is a matter, of course, for the French government to decide. That was the way they chose to play it.
In June, the kidnappers released 2 Frenchmen but seized another one, and 2 more Americans were taken.
كانت مسألة الرهائن ممكن أن تبقى في هذه الحدود، أن يخطفوا وأن يطلقوا في بعيد عن البازار السياسي. إنما الذي جرى إدارة الحكومات الغربية لهذه المسألة هو الذي أزم هذا الأمر، وهو الذي فاقم مسألة الرهائن وحولها في بعض الأحيان إلى مأساة.
You would just do anything to try to get your mind outside of where you were and what was happening. We invented at one point a home for at-risk youths, is the politically correct term. Teenagers are helped by working with animals. So we built this dairy farm.
Terry didn't know anything about agriculture. He knew an awful lot about an awful lot of things, but he would ask me, now what does a cow cost? What does it cost to feed her? What do you have to feed a cow? What about a milking parlor? What's a milking parlor?
How much fat, how much you have to feed them of soybeans and corn and everything, all this minuscule stuff.
He remembered everything I told him, and if I ever gave him an answer that was discrepant from what I had said before, see, that's not what you told me the last time.
And we got out and we found out somebody had already done it out in Oregon.
Back in Washington, Oliver North's clandestine activities were getting more ambitious. He was planning a secret trip by top American officials to Iran to open a new era in US-Iranian relations.
I can assure you that in May of 1986, as the trip is being planned and then executed, everyone had great hopes for the trip. The Secretary of Defense, the Director of Central Intelligence, the President of the United States. In the aftermath, of course, it has no fathers.
I was told that I would volunteer to go on a secret trip to Iran as a Middle East specialist. We would provide some spare parts for Hawk anti-aircraft batteries, and as a demonstration of their goodwill, the Iranians would secure the release of those held hostage in the Lebanon.
As North and the others prepared to fly to Tehran, they were provided with cover names, suicide pills, and a chocolate cake for the Iranians.
Each member of the team was given an Irish passport and a cover story. The purpose of this was to suggest to anyone that we might encounter that we were an Irish trade delegation. Turns out, according to Colonel North and Mr. McFarland, that they each had suicide pills. I had nothing, so I guess I was going to be left for the torture.
As soon as the US team landed in revolutionary Tehran, the mission ran into unexpected difficulties.
We're expecting to be met by some kind of delegation, and there is nobody, absolutely no one there, who knows who we are or why we're to be there.
When we arrived at the hotel, the absence of any competent official and the presence of nothing but fifth-level functionaries led me to boycott any meetings with them.
With nobody to talk to, the American delegation finally received a list of demands from the supposed head of the kidnap gang.
He even had the chutzpah to ask for the reimbursement of all the expenses he incurred for holding the hostages over a number of years.
After 3 days in Tehran, Robert McFarland lost patience.
I was quite emphatic in saying, we're not coming back until there's clear evidence that your government's prepared to deal in good faith. We got on the aircraft and left.
Unaware of any political action on their behalf, the hostages were developing their own crazy view of world politics and presidents, including the new Iranian Speaker of the Parliament, Ali Akbar Rafsanjani.
We'd always referred to Rafsanjani, the Iranian president, as Scottish rough stuff Jimmy. Hey, rough stuff Jimmy. And so it was a lovely idea then to think of the kind of dozy American president and a guy sitting in charge of Iran, and he was a rough stuff Jimmy, like he was actually running this sort of Islamic empire. All these crazy fundamentalist militiamen who thought they were serving God. And he would be going in, with, here we go, here we go, here we go. We were in a surreal world, which at times seemed to be completely off the wall, but clearly the outside world was also mad.
In spite of the failure of the Tehran trip to produce a breakthrough in US-Iran relations, North's secret arms sales did produce a result. In July, American hostage Father Martin Jenko was set free. The US government did not want it known that it was buying hostages by supplying arms to Iran. So when hostages came home, it arranged for the Archbishop of Canterbury's roving envoy, Terry Waite, to be present.
Waite's role was to be a front man. He was there to appear publicly, and on occasions we would summon him and say, okay, Terry, you're going to have to be at a certain place at a certain time because you have to meet the hostages that are going to be released. Waite was beaming, presiding over things, and got a lot of the credit, which is exactly what we'd hoped would happen.
It's not only the United States that needed some degree of cover, if you will, for this very covert operation, but the Iranians did as well. So diplomatically and politically, it served everyone's interest to have Waite involved.
I knew that the Americans were talking to Iran. About what? I knew not. It was never disclosed to me. I hear it said that the Americans said, well, Terry Waite was very useful. And yeah, I mean, I was taking all the attention, in a sense, while in the background it appears that broader political games were being played. And there was I in this exposed, vulnerable position, acting in good faith. And that is a trap. Sometimes you know you're being told the truth. Sometimes you know you're being lied to. Sometimes you do not know. Who do you trust? Where do you put your trust?
We heard one of the hostages go by and ask the guards for a cigarette in a very British accent, very upper-class British accent. Sure enough, two faces appear in a little cell window across the way.
And I saw a head moving in the cells opposite. So I tried to signal by waving my hand inside the bars.
And we waved like this, and one of them stuck a little piece of paper out the window. We weren't supposed to have paper, a pen.
So I'm like, where did he get a pen? Stuck in a little paper out there. It said, I am Irish, my friend is British.
Then Terry decided, hey, we ought to learn that sign language, the deaf-mute alphabet, right? And so he started teaching us the deaf-mute, A, B, C,
And we used
D.
to talk. We talked for hours and hours and days, months, then and later.
It's very, very difficult to tell a joke by sign language because the punchline is incredibly difficult to get. So you would be signalling this joke and you'd look across and it would be Terry Anderson or whoever going. He didn't understand. So you would just spell out, fuck you, you're stupid.
North's arms for hostage deals, as the State Department had warned, could not be kept secret for long. British intelligence had become suspicious of North's meetings in London with his Iranian arms dealer.
We had some indications, nothing more than that the Americans were doing something curious in Iran.
MI5 bugged North's hotel room and discovered that Britain's closest allies, the Americans, were doing deals with Iran behind Mrs. Thatcher's back.
Mrs. Thatcher felt that she'd stuck by the United States, and therefore she felt very unhappy when she heard reports that perhaps she was being diddled, that the Americans were playing a double game with her. And so she sent Sir Percy Craddock to Washington to ascertain the facts. And it was very unsatisfactory because Sir Percy kept asking questions and didn't get a very satisfactory answer in terms of exactly whether there was anything going on.
We called on Poindexter, the newly appointed National Security Advisor. And at the end of it, we added a very general warning about the bad effect, as we saw it, of any deals with terrorists. And he said nothing of any significance in reply. And we left and went home.
And I saw Sir Percy at a cocktail party that evening, and I said, what happened? He explained to me what Poindexter said. I said, well, he lied to you. And that, quite frankly, was what triggered me to write a long memorandum to Secretary of State Schultz saying, it's still going on. The people who are doing it think they're helping the United States. They think it's going to remain secret. They're doing neither. It's going to become public before very long. It's going to be a disaster for the United States and a disaster for President Reagan.
The mood in Beirut also darkened. The kidnappers' demand, the release of their brothers in Kuwait, had still not been met. They took their anger out on Tom Sutherland.
Tempers were heightened, the guards got more hostile, the whole atmosphere was just dark and angry. He was beaten several times, sometimes severely.
I hear him moaning and I could hear the blows on his flesh. It perhaps was harder to take because you knew him.
I thought to myself, I'm not going to take this anymore. I'm not going to let other men treat me this badly.
He said he was going to kill himself. He'd had enough.
Instead of signing, don't forget that Jean and the girls are waiting for you at home.
What words can you signal quickly so that you can get the message over that's going to penetrate deeply enough to say you can't do it?
I mean, they would give us a clean plastic bag every 2 or 3 days. I took the clean one that came in and I pulled it over my head and tied my sock around my neck. And a vision would come up in front of my eyes of a picture that I had taken of Jean and our 3 girls at our cabin up in the mountains. Oh God, I can't do this to those women. And so I'd pull the bag off of my head and I would just sit there gasping for breath.
I can remember his face looking so withdrawn, He looked about 150,000 years old. In the 3 days he had changed so much.
In Iran, Ali Akbar Rafsanjani had also kept the arms for hostages deals with the Americans secret. Rival factions in Tehran were fighting for power. Some in the government opposed contact with America. But the deals were about to be made public on the front cover of a Lebanese magazine.
خبر بأنه في 3 إيرانيين بدهم يشوفوك. قالوا إجا روبرت ماكفرلين على طهران والتقى مع رفسنجاني والتقى مع السيد محمد علي هادي والتقى مع ضابط بالجيش، يعني ضابط كبير. قلت له شو اجى يعملوا؟ روبرت ماكفيلين اجى يعرض اعطاء ايران اسلحه مقابل تضغط على بلبنان لاطلاق سراح الرهائن الغربيين الامريكان تحديدا.
Americagate, as the scandal was known in Iran, almost led to the collapse of Rafsanjani's government. Just before the story was published, David Jacobson received a surprise visit from the head of the kidnap gang.
I heard somebody coming through the door. I put my blindfold on. A man sat down next to me and told me, you're going to be going home. Then he gave me instructions on what to do when I was released. I was to talk about the Kuwaiti prisoners and do the other things. Finally, he said, forget it. Just go home. Get well. Don't hate us.
In early November 1986, the Arms for Hostages story broke in the Western press on the day that hostage David Jacobson was released. Again, US officials made sure Terry Waite was there. But on this occasion, Waite realized he was being given credit that he did not deserve.
I could not understand at that point why he had been released. Ben Weir, clergyman, and Martin Jenko made more sense to me. But Jacobson, no. That to me didn't ring with anything that I had done. And someone came in from the American administration. He said there's a story that Oliver North has been involved in some sort of dealings with Iran. And arms are involved. And at that point, I can remember the feeling. I suddenly felt sick in the stomach. I thought, God.
The exposure of North's activities brought him worldwide attention. His response was immediate.
Shut it down, just destroy everything, because there was going to be a political firestorm. Clearly a link directly back to the White House was a very great political vulnerability for the president.
Right as the story was breaking, got a telephone call from Ali saying, I have just had my ass chewed in the highest quarters. I am to have no further contact with you. When the details started coming in, the only sound I could hear was doors slamming in Washington.
You comment publicly on U.S. contacts with Iran. The administration today reversed itself, and tonight, in a nationally televised address, President Reagan will explain secret U.S. contacts with Iran.
We picked up bits and snippets of information by listening under a door to a radio, or perhaps a TV that the guards were watching.
Wisdom of publicly discussing the matter.
But suddenly the program came on, and it was all about Irangate.
The American public that he did not make a deal to free the hostages. He said
Americans doing deals with arms, getting the money, and it's going to these Nicaragua.
Giving the president some latitude in national security matters.
But it all just sounded so bizarre. We were thinking, right, where do we fit into this thing? But where do we fit in?
That the president failed.
We would hear a clip saying that Thatcher wasn't going to do any deals. So we assumed that she would be very angry with her mate, Ronnie Reagan. And so again, we'd sort of be thinking, so how would they play it out? And we imagined a sort of international phone conversation with, now Ronald, tell me, what have you been doing over there? What is this going on? And what is this man Oliver North? And why are you giving arms to these terrible people and getting hostages out? It's not what we want at all. Oh, well, Margaret, I kind of thought it was a good idea. We got these terrible bad guys somewhere in South America, I think it is. And Ollie, he's a lovely boy. He says, we were doing the right thing.
Select Committee to investigate covert arms transaction with Iran, and the Senate Select Committee on secret military assistance to Iran and the Nicaraguan opposition.
A Senate committee in Washington began a year-long investigation into the illegal arms for hostage deals. The US stopped all contact with the kidnappers and their allies. But politicians in France continued to work behind the scenes to get their men out, offering money, arms, and the release of prisoners from French jails. By 1988, every French hostage would be released.
Une chose qui a été déterminante pour notre libération, c'est le fait que pendant 2 ans, tous les jours, à la télévision, il y avait nos portraits, etc.
Une journée supplémentaire de détention pour Marcel Carton, Marcel Fontaine, Jean-Paul Kaufmann.
Aux États-Unis, qui est l'autre extrême, on a dit aux familles d'otages: taisez-vous, ne faites pas de vagues, si vous voulez qu'ils soient libérés rapidement, il faut être discret. Quel a été le résultat de tout cela? Les Américains ont été libérés les derniers. Les Britanniques, la détention a été un petit peu moins importante, mais nous, on a été libérés les premiers.
Jean-Paul Kaufmann qui embrasse son fils.
The Irangate scandal and the continuing French deals demonstrated to the kidnappers that holding hostages gave them power and influence way beyond the streets of Beirut.
هذا الصراع جعل الجهات الخاطفة أو الجهات المسؤولة عن هذا الموضوع تتمسك أكثر في هذه الورقة وتعتبرها ورقة رابحة من الممكن أن تستغل في الصراع السياسي في الدول الأوروبية وفي الدول الغربية، وممكن أن تدفع أو أن تؤخذ أثمان كثيرة من هذه الورقة، لأن الصراع الحزبي والصراع السياسي حول السلطة في هذه الدول جعل ورقة الرهائن هي الورقة الأساسية في هذا الصراع.
By the end of 1986, Irangate had forced the American government to rejoin the British in saying no deals with the kidnappers. With no one now working for the release of the remaining British and American hostages, Terry Waite saw himself as their last hope.
I thought, this has been a whole nasty, miserable conspiracy. And my integrity was on the line. I said to myself, you've nothing to be afraid of. You can go back and meet these men. There's nothing to hide as far as you're concerned. And if you do not do it, what does that say about your faith? That's where my decision was taken. So I went back.
And that was where he miscalculated, I think, was the feeling that he had some individual worth in this beyond his role simply as a sort of intermediary and a front man for the United States government that was providing the weapons.
Waite returned to a city alive with rumors about his connection with North and the arms deals.
مسألة تيري ويت تمثل قمة التصعيد في لعبة الرهائن بين الخاطفين وبين الغرب.
My position as an independent envoy has been honored and respected.
We hear Terry Waite's name all the time. On the radio at this one point. We had no news. Terry Waite's back in town.
With whom I met, or what passed between us.
Saeed would come in and say, Terry Waite here, maybe you're going home soon. Soon and very soon you're going home.
You know, you start up the roller coaster again and we're feeling very optimistic. And then there was a burst of stuff about Terry Waite.
About any of those points we crossed lines.
And it stopped.
Lebanese witnesses describe Terry Waite's last hours of freedom.
جرى تسريب معلومات أن الاستخبارات الأمريكية قد زرعت في جسم تيري ويت أجهزة بث لاقطة.
أذكر في ذلك الوقت يعني وضعت له المخاوف العديدة وهو أصر حتى بنوع من المزحة نوع من الجوك قال لي إنه بصير مان أوف ذا يير. بحطوا لي صورتي على بالتايمز ماجازين على الغلاف الخارجي ونبهته إنه هناك خطورة من الانتقال خارج الزون اللي عم نحكي فيه.
عندها تم استدراجه مجددا وأرسلت له دعوة أنه تمت الموافقة على أن يرى الرهائن في بيروت وعليه أن يحضر إلى بيروت.
On the 20th of January 1987, a year after his first visit to Beirut, Terry Waite set off for a second time to meet the hostage takers. It would be another 4 years before the world would see him again.
There was my contact. Are you ready? He said. I said yes. I said, right, we're going to take you to see the hostages. We drove into what I believe was a garage under the basement of an apartment block. I was told to get out. Pushed across the floor. There was a trapdoor in the floor I could see from beneath my blindfold. When I was told to jump down, I was pushed across the floor. A door slammed behind me. And then when I took off my blindfold, I was in a tiled cell. I knew that was it.